Hello, everyone. Good evening. I hope you've all had a great weekend. My name is Caitlin Fung. I'm a senior at Rutgers University. I'm double majoring in psychology and cognitive science with a minor in gender and media. I'm also a second-year leadership scholar at the Institute for Women's Leadership. This past summer, through a connection with an IWL alumna, I interned on the production of a PBS Terra series called Sharks Unknown. The series follows shark scientist Jasmine Graham as she travels across the country, conversing with fellow shark scientists and investigating shark species. Sharks Unknown not only highlights the diversity of sharks in our oceans, but also amplifies the voices of racial and gender minorities in shark sciences. In my role as an assistant editor and production assistant, I saw firsthand the team's passion for ocean justice. I learned of the resilience of sharks as survivors of every major mass extinction event and the major threat ocean heat waves are having on their livelihood. One major takeaway from my summer around sharks was that although humans are actively destroying their ocean home, it's not too late to play an active part in fighting to save it. This brings us to tonight's important conversation on fighting for ocean justice with Dr. Roxane Gay and Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. Dr. Roxane Gay is the Gloria Steinem Endowed Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies here at Rutgers. In addition to this prestigious position, Dr. Gay wears a myriad of hats that grants her the opportunity to touch lives around the globe. She's a best-selling author, editor, social commentator, and professor. She has authored a number of books, including Hunger, Bad Feminist, and most recently, Opinions. Dr. Gay platforms writers and encourages discussion through her newsletter, The Audacity, and her podcast, The Roxane Gay Agenda. Last year, I had the privilege of learning from Dr. Gay in the classroom, and she not only made me a better writer, but a better person by reframing my worldview, inspiring me to pursue issues I care about, and instilling me with the confidence to share my opinions. Joining Dr. Gay tonight is Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a marine biologist, writer, and policy expert. She's the co-founder of Ocean Lab and the All You Can Save project, both of which are initiatives that develop leadership to enact climate policy and build community. Dr. Johnson also has a podcast called How to Save a Planet, where she flips climate anxiety on its head and galvanizes listeners to act towards saving our planet. She is on the board of directors for Patagonia and Greenwave, and on the advisory board for the Environmental Voter Project and Scientific American. She co-edited the best-selling climate anthology, All We Can Save, and has her own book coming out titled What If We Get It Right? Copies of books by both authors will be available for purchase after tonight's conversation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gay and Dr. Johnson for a talk on ocean justice.
Doctor. I generally only make men call me doctor, and it's so satisfying. It is. Thank you, Caitlin, for that lovely introduction. Caitlin is an incredible scholar, and I cannot wait to see what she continues to do in the world. But today we're here to talk a little bit about ocean justice. And one of the things that I find most striking about your work is that I wouldn't say it's necessarily optimistic, but you don't give in to a lot of the climate anxiety that many of our discussions around climate change seem to carry. And why is that?
I guess I'm just not a quitter. And I know that we have the solutions we need. Mm-hmm. So it's not like we don't know what to do. It's not that we don't have the tools. It's that we lack the political will. It's that culture isn't caught up with the science, right? And so those are what I would call surmountable. Mm-hmm. And so it's a question of how we can, it's a question of implementation, to put it in the perhaps the most boring way possible. And so I find that to be like tractable and practical question of, okay, how do we fish more sustainably? How do we make sure coastal communities can benefit from offshore wind energy being developed? How can we think about access to the coastline for everyone instead of just wealthy coastal homeowners? You know, all of these things are like very solvable problems if we have the will to do it. So that's actually why my work has shifted over the last decade from quite, really specific scientific field work to ocean policy, to a lot of communications and cultural work, because oftentimes cultural change precedes policy change. So I've kind of gotten in the mix of a lot of things along the way.
What is the most interesting thing about moving more toward policy than the science of sustainability?
I really enjoy the chance to think strategically about all this. It is a chess game, right? Like, which politicians and which federal agencies, and, is there just like a tiny thing in some like hidden regulation that you wouldn't necessarily think of needs to be changed? For example, we have here in the audience an architect friend of mine, Juana Stanescu, who co-founded something called the Plus Pool, which is a nonprofit based in New York City, which is trying to create a public swimming pool in the East River, tethered to the shore. And it turns out New York City's, waters are clean enough to swim in like 90-something% of the time because of the Clean Water Act of 1970, which prevented all of this pollution from industry, et cetera. Most of the times the water meets the very high standards required for swimming. But after it rains, that's not true, right? You have all this runoff from land of pollution. So right after it rains, don't go swimming in New York Harbor. But other times it's mostly fine. And so that nonprofit, in advance of, getting the right to actually build this thing, has been working with the city and state government in New York to create what's called like a wet weather exemption, which would enable future swimming stuff in those waters. So it's really interesting to think of that, like the waters meet the swimming standards 99% of the time or whatever it is, but once you have this really specific, dorky, new categorization of like wet weather exemptions, suddenly you can have a fun swimming pool.
I would never have guessed that about the East River.
Yeah.
It's funny because
we have
I
seahorses
see people
living
there.
in the East River. There are like whales coming through, turtles coming through, dolphins. Like, we have a very sturgeon are, migrating up the Hudson. We have all of the species that we've ever had in this estuary are still there. They're in, depressed numbers. And that is like this introduction about the resilience of Starks, there is all of this opportunity for resilience because all the building blocks really are still there.
You mentioned earlier that there is a gap between the science and the culture. How do we start to close those gaps?
I've been thinking about that a lot today because I spent the weekend with a dear friend of mine who works in the cultural space as a curator and running a creative agency. And I would, call her an environmentalist by any sort of dictionary definition. She grew up sort of romping in the woods of British Columbia and has this very close relationship with moss and ferns, etc. But she, like many, do not understand the urgency of the problem, right? I think we're at the point where most people are like, yes, climate change, it's bad, we should do something about it. But it hasn't really changed our day-to-day lives. It's not changing our intimate decisions. It's not changing, for many people, where they buy a house or how they get around or what jobs they consider or what career paths they're choosing or, what they do in their spare time. We're still sort of like living our lives as if the world hasn't changed without thinking about the fact that, wildfires will only get worse. Fire season is no longer a season. It's all year round. I just was reading something this weekend that the wildfires in Canada this past year released more carbon than everything else that happens in Canada in a year. All the transportation, all the electricity, all the agriculture, everything else that all of the millions of people there do is dwarfed by what just went up in flames. And so we have a completely different paradigm. I mean, the water in Florida hit 100 degrees this year.
Which is boiling-ish.
It's literally a hot tub. Like a hot tub is like 102. Like it's too hot for things to live there. So you have all these marine species that are migrating away from the equator towards the poles. And, corals can't move, so they're just frying in place. And that is the cultural part that worries me the most, is that we're all just going about our lives as if incremental change will somehow solve the problem, when what is needed is a complete transformation from an extractive fossil fuel-based economy to a regenerative, circular, renewable one. And so what I want people to start to feel is the need for transformation.
It seems like oftentimes when it comes to massive cultural change, which this is going to require, we need something catastrophic to happen. And it seems like that is going to be the way of the planet as well. Are we going to be able, and of course I know that you're not a seer and can't predict the future, but do you think that we will reach a point of no return in terms of changing our lifestyles, changing our dependence on fossil fuels, and creating different ways of engaging with the planet?
Well, the first part of that about, it'll take some catastrophe to change. I mean, the sort of sick joke that we used to make in this ocean climate nerd circles was like, well, maybe when a hurricane hits New York City, people will finally wake up. And we had Hurricane Sandy hit New York and New Jersey, and that didn't really change very much. We've had, every imaginable unprecedented extreme weather disaster fueled by climate change in the past few years, and yet very little has changed. At the same time, what has really fundamentally changed is the economics of switching to renewables. So wind and solar are now cheaper than oil and gas and coal in almost every situation in the United States. And so based just on the cost-benefit analysis, we are making that transition. It's just a matter of how quickly we're going to do it. Will we get there fast enough? I'm sure that we will get there at some point soon. And one small public service announcement along these lines is that the federal government, I guess it was early this year, passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most ridiculous name, but it included hundreds of billions of dollars in funding for climate projects. And this is maybe not the exact correct audience for this PSA, because this is really for homeowners. And a lot of you are probably too young to be in that category quite yet. Also, who can afford to buy a home these days? But it includes really significant tax credits for putting solar on your home, for switching from a gas stove to an induction stove, for putting in heat pumps, for switching to electric hot water heaters. I bought a home this year, and I will get 30% of the cost of solar panels back. And people do not know about this. So if you know anyone who owns a home and wants to transition off of fossil fuels, there are massive federal tax credits to accelerate this, which is nothing short of a miracle that this got through our wild congressional scenario.
I know, especially now. Good luck with getting Mike Johnson to even spell solar. I didn't know about that.
Yeah.
And I've been considering the move. Oh my God, solar panels, here I come. I'm always curious about where our passions begin. And I know that you grew up in Brooklyn.
Oh, wait, I didn't answer the second part of your question,
yes.
which was very good, which was repeat it for us.
Oh my God.
First part was about the extreme weather, and then like what will it take to get the cultural shift?
Yeah,
Something
well,
like that?
not only what will it take, but will we reach a point of no return?
Oh yes, this apocalyptic, delightful inquiry. I think. Well, the answer is certainly yes for ecosystems, and the answer is certainly yes for glaciers, and the answer is certainly yes in terms of sea level rise. We can't reverse any of those things. When coral reefs are gone, they're gone for at least all of our lifetimes. They can sort of like, they have gone through extinction cycles before, but these are like million-year cycles, right? And there's a glacier in Iceland that is like extinct. There's a plaque where the glacier used to be to commemorate that ice formation. So we are seeing a lot, and species extinctions are not reversible as much as like some egomaniacs want to bring back mastodons or whatever. I don't think that's a great source of our resources, even if we could.
Probably not. Jurassic Park has shown us how
Yes.
that's going to work.
If we've
out.
learned nothing from cinema, it's leave the dinosaurs in the past. Although I have like a really good velociraptor impersonation.
Oh my God, I love a velociraptor.
For another time.
Just, I would love to see that someday.
Favorite dinosaur? Yeah.
Yes.
So I think that's point of no return environmentally. Yes, we've already reached some of them, but I think in the same way, sharks are very adaptive and resilient, so are humans. So we will have to live differently, and we will have to live in different places. And a significant portion of the work that I do with Urban Ocean Lab, my policy think tank, is thinking about sea level rise and the future of coastal cities. And what does it look like to move people out of harm's way? And in terms of the justice piece of that, there are a lot of ways to do that wrong. Managed retreat is a term we often hear, which really takes away agency from coastal communities. So we use the term climate-driven relocation, semantics, but perhaps in a meaningful way. And the question there is, at what point do we stop rebuilding in the same places? This was a really big conversation after Hurricane Katrina. And it was, and it's after a disaster is the wrong time to be having that conversation, when people are displaced, when all they want to do is like get back to their place, their home, their community, bring their family back together. And people have really deep cultural ties to the land. It's not just like a college dorm that's a transitional moment of your life. This is maybe generations in these places. And communities of color and low-income communities are more likely to be in low-lying, flood-prone areas because those were the less expensive places to live. And so there's really deep justice issues about how we make that transition, and these conversations need to be happening on sunny days so we can think about that in a strategic way, because what happened after Katrina was they tried to basically like rezone the city for where you couldn't rebuild without really a plan for taking care of the culture, the communities, the transition of that, and really sort of leaving communities of color in the lurch in a horrible way.
Now, you're from Brooklyn.
Fort Greene.
Excellent.
I'm sorry, I should say like old Fort Greene, for those of
Yes.
you who know the current Fort Greene, not that version.
So you're from Old Fort Greene. How does a girl from Old Fort Greene get interested in marine biology?
I think any kid who learns about the ocean falls in love with it. It's so amazing. I mean, octopuses, sharks, coral reefs, like you name it. Like the ocean is just extremely cool. And so I had, a very normal experience in that way of just being like, ooh, this is great. Tell me more. Can this be my job? But the very specific version of that story and that applied to, I should say, forests as well, and fields of wildflowers as well. There's this very innate love of nature, this biophilia that all humans have, and we sort of lose it as we age. And I think I was both lucky and deliberate in being able to hold on to that. But my parents decided that, when I was 5, it was time for me to learn to swim. It was like an important life skill. And this was back in the day when Eastern Airlines existed, and there were like super cheap flights to Florida from New York.
You're taking me all the way back.
It's like a very specific timestamp. Often delayed 7 hours, but like really cheap flights.
You still got there, though.
And so my parents took me to Key West, Florida, which was, and I think still is, like a gay party mecca too.
Yes.
And so our upstairs neighbors in Brooklyn were this gay couple that came with us on this vacation. They were like, we're going to Key West. My parents were like, great, we'll come with you. And we just
with
like,
a child.
with this
Amazing.
5-year-old. And so we found this little bed and breakfast with a lovely pool, and I basically would never get out of the pool. I would like request peanut butter and jelly sandwiches be served to me while I like stood in the shallow end. And this, our Nick and Steve, our family friends and neighbors, basically like stopped going clubbing at night because it was so fun hanging out in the pool with me in the morning. They like shifted their social schedule to be less nocturnal, which was a blast for me to have more grown-ups playing with me in the pool. But I had such a like delightful and cozy learning to swim experience, which I only later found out was very deeply marred by racism, because my Black Jamaican father showed up a week after the rest of us got there, and like most people wouldn't get in the pool anymore. So I was like, this is great. We can do cannonballs and no one's getting mad at me for splashing. Meanwhile, my splashes were probably like very tiny. But I didn't know that part of the story. And like the maids were told not to service our room. And like one took pity on us and like snuck my mom clean sheets after the first week. But all of these like layers to it, and knowing that if I had Black American parents, they very likely would not have had the opportunity to learn to swim, which is why Black children have like a 5 times higher rate of drowning than white children in America. And so I had no idea how aberrant my childhood was, but it was, it was the learning to swim. It was going to the beach down there, and it was going on a glass bottom boat and seeing a coral reef and all of the colors of the fish, and just being astounded that there was this complete other universe of like weird aliens that lived under the surface of the ocean that I wanted to know everything about. And then an aquarium, which is a much more sort of accessible version of a glass bottom boat, and getting to hold sea urchins and starfish and, feel these crazy tube feet on the palm of your hands and just think like, obviously this should be my entire career.
And you've made it your entire career. And
stubborn, I think, is the real answer to your question in one word. Just stubborn childhood dream.
Well, I think that's the way most people, myself included, make those childhood dreams come to fruition. And I know when you were doing your dissertation research, you actually talked to fishermen about ways that they could make fishing, about ways we could all make fishing more sustainable. And that was really interesting, because it's surprising how often people who are going to be directly affected by policy are not consulted. And so how did you have the idea that you were going to actually reach out to fishermen, and how did they respond about maybe having a say in something that is going to so materially affect them?
Like everything I've done, it was sort of a following my nose evolution of the work. So I started graduate school with really interested in marine parks and protected areas, and ended up, I had a friend in graduate school who needed a scuba diving buddy for her coral spawning research, and so I ended up in Curacao diving with her. and met the head of the fisheries department there and talked to him about, how they were managing fishing, kind of what they were thinking about for making it more sustainable. And he told me that they were thinking about requiring by law of this new design of fish trap that, included slots to let the juvenile fish and the ornamental sort of like Nemo-shaped species get out. But they had never tested it. It was based on a lobster trap in Bermuda, to let fish out of a lobster trap in Bermuda. And he was like, if we just do this based on that and it doesn't work, the fishermen are going to be pissed. So I was like, well, I can design this and work with fishermen to like make them and deploy them. And I can test 4 different trap designs in 3 different reefs around the island and like randomly assign them locations and rotate them. I was doing like 4 dives a day, 6 days a week for 3 months to see if you put a hole in a fish trap, would the fish smaller than the hole get out, which is so obvious. But this is how science works if you need to get something through peer review. So basically, yes, the small fish get out of the slot. And fishermen don't lose any money because those have very, very little market value. And so thinking about, and that's now required by law in Curacao and several other Caribbean islands. This trap design is also used in East Africa through colleagues that I have worked with there. And so that was my first introduction to science and policy. I was like, oh, I could just like do an experiment that would inform fisheries regulations, and then the regulations would get changed, which is kind of an addictive first project. You're like, what are we doing next? And then I started studying gill nets, which are another very sort of destructive, high bycatch mortality type of fishing, and realized that it was not about the fish, right? The fish are doing everything they're supposed to do. They're swimming around, they're eating, they're getting eaten, they're making babies. But it's about what people are doing to the ocean, and let me better understand the human elements of this. So then I spent the next 3 months driving around in a rental car with like a cooler full of beer in the trunk and folding chairs and little bags of chips, sort of hanging out at fishing docks, interrupting dominoes games, and just talking to people and trying to understand how they were using the ocean. And even more deeply, like what was their professional or family history with the ocean? Like what were the traditions that were most important to them? How had they seen things change over their lifetimes? And they're of course very aware of the effects of the decline in fisheries, but they were like, it is not our fault. It is cruise ships coming in and polluting. It is jet skis and the noise. It is all these tourists slathering on sunscreen and then jumping right in the ocean, and you see these like iridescent oil slicks of sunscreen. They're like, that smell is scaring the fish away. The fish are going deeper. It's foreign fishermen coming near shore with their big nets. It's pollution running off from land and the lack of wastewater treatment. They're like, we are the ones getting blamed exclusively for the decline in fish populations, but it is way more than that. And you ask all the scuba divers there, who were basically like white, Dutch, young people coming to like have their Caribbean year or two teaching scuba diving for fun, who don't have the same generational dependence and especially don't have the same generational understanding of what the reefs used to be. They're like, everything is great. There are fewer fish. It's definitely the fishermen's fault. And so you have these 2 groups of people that are in or on the water every day who have completely different perceptions of the problem. And so, of course, have completely different perceptions of what the regulatory solutions would be, which I would never have known if I hadn't spent 1,000 hours drinking beer with fishermen, which is basically like what I joke my PhD is actually in. That is like my area of expertise. And it was through that and through, like, I asked them all sorts of questions about which types of regulations they would support. But the really interesting answer was to the question, if you could write the rules to manage fishing, what would they be? It was not multiple choice. It was just like, if you were in charge, if you were the king of fishing laws. And they had so many like much more sort of useful and progressive and sort of holistic ideas than one might have expected if you weren't part of that community already. And they were also so grateful to be asked. Because like you're saying, oftentimes the communities most affected don't get the opportunity to really weigh in. You have some sort of public comment period, but people feel like it doesn't matter, or it's like a meeting at a time or a place that's inconvenient for them, or what's even the point. And so, I was able to share those results with the Fisheries Department, which led to much more conservation measures being put in place, because they realized that fishermen actually really supported them as long as wasn't just them getting scapegoated as the entire problem. And so it just made me think, okay, if we approach these problems more holistically, it seems like that would be harder to solve the bigger version of the problem, but it actually makes things more possible because you are seeing the full problem, which means you have a greater chance at addressing it at the scale that would be meaningful.
So that was your first, or one of your first experiences with policy, and now you've transitioned into primarily working on policy. And I know that after the Green New Deal was publicly revealed, you noticed that there was a gap between that and dealing with oceans and thinking about oceans. And so you've called for a Blue New Deal that does focus explicitly on oceans. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about what the Blue New Deal is about and where are we politically in terms of making something like that happen?
First, has anyone read the Green New Deal? One person maybe. Okay. How long do you think the Green New Deal is? Like how many pages? Just shout out numbers.
1.
10, 40. What else do we have? You assume that it's long, most of you? I assumed it was going to be hundreds of pages long. I was very relieved to open the PDF and find out that it was 14 pages. And the first page is all the co-sponsors. There were something like 90 co-sponsors, which is just like a list of names of members of Congress. And it's double spaced. It's like 16-point font. It would literally take you like 10 minutes to read it. This is the big secret about the Green New Deal. And it is written in completely plain English. It is not highly technical language. It's very digestible. And it really is a vision statement for what would it look like if our federal government actually created comprehensive climate policy that had justice at the core. And so I was very excited to see that, and a Green New, and it's a resolution, not a bill, right? And so it's a vision statement, essentially, that would take many pieces of legislation to make the vision real. So, for example, the first piece that was introduced was a Green New Deal for public housing. How do we get, public housing, switch to renewable energy, and do all of these retrofits that are needed, and have, support community involvement in all of this? Because the federal government actually has control over public housing in a way that we don't for private homes. And the same, like a Green New Deal for public schools is another thing that's been introduced. How now that it's like intolerably hot in September, and in May and June, and most schools don't have central air conditioning because they were built in a time when that was not needed during the school year. So there's many pieces of legislation that it would take to make a Green New Deal real, and you should all go read it before you have an opinion on it. So I think when I read it, though, I got to page like 10 or 12 or something, and I saw the first mention of the ocean. It was like on the list of things we should protect, like forests and meadows and whatever else, the ocean. And I thought, well, this will not work, because we now know the latest scientific assessment says that the ocean, 35% of the climate solutions we need are found in the ocean in terms of emission reductions. So that's, offshore renewable energy, that's protecting and restoring coastal ecosystems, that's shifting our food system to regenerative ocean farming and sustainable seafood, it's reducing emissions of shipping, it's zero emissions ports and that kind of overhaul and transformation. And And so I knew that unless the ocean had a larger role in federal climate policy, it simply would not get us where we need to go. And so I started working with colleagues to think about what that would look like. And that has evolved over the years. And now, it started as like an op-ed where we were like, you guys missed the boat. And then it became a campaign plan with Elizabeth Warren's team, because she was just asked in a town hall meeting, what would you think about a Blue New Deal in addition to the green one? And she's like, that would be a great idea. And next thing you know, I am getting like cold called by her policy staff being like, so apparently we're writing a Blue New Deal plan. Can you help us figure out what that should entail? And, more policy memos, more op-eds. And now a lot of the recommendations, the woman that on Warren's team that I co-authored the Blue New Deal with is now on the White House climate team and helping to push some of these policy ideas forward, including, how we shift permitting for, wind energy offshore, and how we support regenerative farming in the ocean so it gets some of the same supports like crop insurance that farmers get on land. So it's not like there will be a moment when we have like a Blue New Deal. I mean, there's sort of like a checklist, a long checklist of elements of what robust federal ocean climate policy would look like. And my attention is now shifted more to what that would look like at a city level with Urban Ocean Lab, because city governments can really make a lot of those changes happen more expediently and creatively. And, 20% of our population lives in coastal cities. And 60% of those people are people of color, and a lot of immigrants and low-income people who are being very heavily impacted by this work. So not a coastal elite issue, despite what you may have heard.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you hear those statistics, because whenever we talk about the coasts politically, it is the coastal elites. And when you think about a lot of the news stories, it's about, some billionaire buying some, $100 million house in the Hamptons, like taking up all that beautiful ocean. And yet, really, it is a lot of working class people and immigrants who are living in these coastal places that are going to eventually be underwater. And so there is this activist component to so much of what you do, because you have to look at that it's not just about the environment, but who the environment is affecting. And when it's communities that don't receive a lot of political advocacy, how do you bring that into your work and make sure that we're not just focusing on sort of the broad issue and pretending that everyone is affected by climate change in the same way?
It's something I didn't really think about until 2020, even though sort of in my bones I knew it to be true, right? I had been working with fishing communities in the Caribbean. Of course, like I understood the justice element of it, but I hadn't really written about or verbalized it in any sort of like social justice terms. And obviously it's a very different scenario when you're working in like a mostly black place or in a place that's dealing with a colonial history that's really at the surface. It's just a very different socio-political scenario and much closer ties to the ocean than we have even in a place like this. Like I only thought I could become a marine biologist once I went to the Caribbean, even though I grew up in a place that has over 500 miles of coastline and is an archipelago. And so for me, it was Black Lives Matter 2020, realizing that it was an opportunity and a responsibility to help people connect the dots. And so for me, that's sort of like, I don't know, like race, class, culture have always been at the heart of my work, but I never really felt like I had to talk about it until I realized like, oh, people don't get it. Like it just all seemed so obvious to me. And suddenly I find myself in this moment where all these environmentalists have to post something on social media about Black Lives Matter, but they want it to relate to the environment. And so everybody's like, Ayana, what do you think? Because I'm like their one black friend. And so I wrote this op-ed that was published in the Washington Post and, went viral to the extent that I've had anything have that kind of reach. And it basically said, like, you cannot solve climate change without people of color. Because so often we think just about who's most impacted, but that piece was making the case that you actually need us to solve it with you. Mm-hmm. And the sort of like the fundamental data underlying that, not that we should need data, because this is, you know, the biggest challenge humanity's ever faced. Of course, we need the biggest team, and we need to make change in every community, in every sector. So we need leaders in every sector, in every community. But people of color just straight up care more about the climate crisis, are more deeply concerned. Like, we have really robust polling on this. It's about 49% of white people who are concerned, about 57 to 60% of black people, and about 70% of Latinx folks. And so if we want to, like, charge ahead with solutions, we need to bring the people who already are aware of the problem. Mm-hmm. And so that was sort of the pitch that I made, that we cannot solve the climate crisis until Black lives actually matter. Mm-hmm. Because we are burdened by all these other sort of like day-to-day urgencies that prevent people who already care and would be predisposed to getting involved in the transformation we need, who have to deal with all sorts of other shit.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the biggest challenges that I think a lot of people face when we try and figure out what can we actually do about it is this idea of collective versus individual action. And I know in your TED Talk, you talk about how fossil fuel companies actually invented the term carbon footprint, which I think is really interesting because they're always putting the onus on the individual, and things like that personally drive me crazy, like the carbon offsets. Uh-huh. Like, no, you can't actually buy your way out of your plane ticket. It's just, it is what it is.
Especially with all those forests going up in smoke that are based, the credits are based on.
Yes. And so you tend to also focus on the reality that we can actually make individual changes. And so how do you reach people to make us all understand that, yes, in addition to the fossil fuel companies like ceasing and desisting, which we know isn't going to happen anytime soon, that we can do things? What are the things that you start to suggest to people that we can actually do in our day-to-day lives, no matter where we are in our lives, to try and create change? Is it just driving an electric car, which is great, but it's so hard to, no, I have an electric car, it's fine, but it's different. And, you know, like, what are the things we can actually do to be better?
There's a very long list. I think on the personal side, in this sort of like electric car category, obviously your own transportation matters. But because I fly almost exclusively for work, there is nothing I can do in my personal life to make up for the carbon footprint of my air travel. I could be, 100% vegan at all times and never get in walk everywhere or bike everywhere and still and never buy another thing, and it would still not make up for that. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to sort of like keep things in that perspective when it comes to our personal lives. But the thing that I just recently began to appreciate was, obviously we all need to get our homes off of fossil fuels, as we discussed. That's a really big one. The other one is thinking about where we keep our money. Because for people who are middle-aged or nearing retirement and have any sort of retirement savings, the money that you have in the bank is almost certainly funding not just fossil fuels, but the expansion of fossil fuels. JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, I'm forgetting the other two, but there's like 4 big banks in America that are essentially bankrolling the fossil fuel industry. So all that stuff that you've got invested and earning interest is being redeployed to create more pipelines, to put in more oil rigs, et cetera. And that can be having like a much, much bigger carbon footprint than anything else you would ever do. Many times any sort of like electricity you use or transportation you do. So think about that. I moved what savings I have into a climate-friendly account a few years ago, which felt really good. But I think it's, as you mentioned, like fossil fuel companies have popularized through marketing campaigns with Ogilvy, like PR firm, this concept of a carbon footprint to make us all think about this as individuals when it is very clearly a collective sort of like transformation level problem and solution. And so what I encourage people to do is think about how you can be part of systems level change and how you can be less of an individual and what efforts can you join. And so in the TED Talk that you mentioned, I put forward this framework of a climate action Venn diagram, which basically says three circles overlapping. What are you good at? What is the work that needs doing, climate and justice solutions, and what brings you joy or satisfaction or what gets you out of bed in the morning? So I really want people to think about the what are you good at question. Because Roxane, if you and I did the exact same thing to help with the climate crisis, one or both of us would be wasting our talents. Because we have different skills, resources, networks to bring to the table. So my goal is for everyone to find like their own climate action sweet spot. So for me, that's Urban Ocean Lab, right? As like a marine biologist from Brooklyn who's like a policy and design nerd. I'm like changing laws is my jam. Like that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. So how can we work at that intersection? And it would be different for you. It'll be different for all of us. And so that is my dream, that there's a million different climate solutions that need more effort, and that we should join an existing initiative or organization. I think there's a lot of people who think they have to quit their job or start a new nonprofit, and you really don't. You can I'm sure there's a lot Rutgers could do to be better on climate, right? Like you all have a lot of power in that you are affiliated with this university I don't even know if Rutgers has divested their endowment, but like there's been this huge wave of colleges divesting. Hundreds of colleges now in the US have. Harvard finally did, my alma mater. We're talking about billions of dollars that we can shift away from investing in fossil fuels. So there's a huge campaign of students who are forcing their colleges to divest, thinking about shifting retirement funds for faculty. Like you can demand these things of your administration. How is your campus getting off of fossil fuels? How is your food services starting to shift to more sustainable options for people? How are we getting away from single-use plastics everywhere when we're not really taking things to go? We're all just sitting here on campus, right? All of these kinds of things. So think about like the ripples that you can make beyond your personal daily life, because it's so tempting to get sucked into like just this sort of navel-gazing obsession with your own carbon footprint or single-use plastics use, and that just won't get us where we need to go. You're just gonna be like a really annoying environmentalist.
No.
Who's just like giving everyone the stink eye when they like have, whatever.
It's interesting that you bring up divestment, because when I was in high school and college, the big push was to divest from South Africa. And it did actually work. And we got Yale, my alma mater, to divest from Coca-Cola, which was a huge investor in South Africa at the time. And so it's, I think sometimes we don't think we have power as 18, 19, 20-year-olds, but you actually do. If enough people sort of contribute their voices to something, universities do pay attention.
When I was in college, it was the living wage campaign.
Oh.
So there were like 100 students who basically like pitched tents in Harvard Yard to campaign for a living wage for the janitors and food service workers on campus. And it worked. No one wants 100 students living in tents on the quad,
Also, with that endowment, they should be so embarrassed to not be paying a
also,
living
they
wage.
don't need to worry about returns. And also, fossil fuel companies don't have great returns anymore because it is like not a great industry and everyone is divesting from them. Do you want to lead the divestment campaign at Rutgers?
What was that?
Someone should.
There was. Good.
Did it pass? Yeah. Okay. So you're off the hook.
We're on the road. All right. Divest now. So I know that you have an anthology you co-edited with Catherine Wilkinson, and in it you brought together women from a lot of different areas to talk about climate change, the ways we can contribute, all of the ways that we can actually make change. And you also included poetry, which I love to see, because oftentimes in anthologies, especially that are directed to a similar goal, you are going to see straight prose, and people often overlook poetry as a way of creating change. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about that project and how you brought it together and why you chose to include poetry, because we don't often connect poetry to climate change.
I think it's part of like what you mentioned before with just, there's this sense of like, people are overwhelmed when thinking about climate. There's a lot of anxiety thinking about all the ways that things could go terribly wrong and how little agency we feel. And so it just seemed like we needed something lovely included. And there's something about the way that poetry, with its like few words perfectly chosen, can just capture the feeling of it. And I think part of the goal of the book was to make people feel less alone. And in that same way that like I may listen to Nina Simone to like go deeper into sadness when I'm feeling sad. It's like you just want it. It's just so comforting to know that someone else has felt that before. Yeah. And Catherine and I just like poetry. Actually, could you do me a small favor and grab one of the books from the hallway? Maybe we could like have a poem in the middle of this. Yeah.
While she's doing that, what is the book you're working on now?
The book I'm working on now is called What If We Get It Right? Visions of Climate Futures. And in some ways, it's like a volume 2 of All We Can Save, because I so intimidated myself by the scope of the book, because who am I as one person to answer that question, what if we get it right? It just seemed, I don't know, I guess my ego isn't quite big enough to think I had the answer that everyone should buy and read. And so I turned it into, it is now a set of 20 interviews, heavily abridged. Thank you. And some essays by me, and again, some poetry. As well as quotes. And the quotes are there, for poignant chapter openers or whatever, but also to bring in more voices and names. So in All We Can Save, we quoted politicians who we would never have had write essays, and quoted, other scientists and people who are really helping to shape the narrative, in the hopes that people who read these books will who is that? And like, should I learn more about their work? So it was just a way to make it a broader collection as well. So yes, the book, What If We Get It Right? I asked most of the interviewees a similar set of questions, but it's everyone from, farmer, forester, architect, landscape architect, museum curator, filmmaker, Hollywood producer, indigenous organizer, climate justice leaders, policymakers, nonprofit executives, you name it. And asking all of them, AI, executive in there too, asking all of them a similar set of questions about like, well, what would the world look like if we get it right, if we actually deployed all these solutions we have at our fingertips? Because I realized that for me, and I think for many of us, you don't want to like do a lot of work and deal with a lot of change unless you think what you're going to get on the other side is worth the effort. And it just felt to me like we have all of this apocalyptic media, film, reporting. We don't have a lot of that show me it's worth it. So this is basically my attempt to show people that it's worth it, and what are the hurdles that we need to overcome to get there.
We are happy to take questions. Our guest is happy to take questions, and so just throw your hand up, because I know you guys can project if you have any about this planet. Yes.
The offshore wind example is a particularly good one. You mentioned that, wealthy people don't want offshore wind turbines to disturb their view. I think what people don't understand is offshore wind has evolved so much in the last decade that the turbines are now miles offshore. They're like this big at the horizon. So if anyone's complaining about that, like, I just honestly don't care. I mean, it was the Kennedys who opposed offshore wind in off Cape Cod because they didn't want to ruin their view. And you have like lots of, wealthy people with sailboats who are like, oh, this might impede my navigation, as if we can't steer. And so I think, and so there's some people who are like actually trying to write into regulation that, ruining someone's view cannot be a reason to deny a permit. So there are some people, sort of thinking about that. So it actually does cross party lines. And there are also, people of, both Democrat and Republican in the Hamptons who are opposing offshore wind because they don't want the cables that transmit the electricity coming onshore. Not really understanding that we have so many cables under our beaches already for telecommunications.
I was going to say, do they know about a little thing called the internet?
Most people also don't know that the internet is like literal cables on the seafloor.
Yeah.
It is not all satellites. It is like a very physical on this planet system. So I think the other element of the offshore wind debate, especially in New Jersey, is that there are conservative funders which have fomented and funded opposition to offshore wind among groups who have never expressed any particular environmental concern in the past, and it has become like a right-wing litmus test. And all of a sudden you hear these people like trying to save the whales, and it's like, when did you start caring about whales? This is really just like an anti-Democrat, anti-Green New Deal thing, right? And it's like tons of really problematic misinformation. So this like both of your questions sort of like can be exemplified in that one case study of offshore wind in New Jersey of the how do we get anything done with the politics, and how do we get things done not even when there's a winner and a loser, but then when there's a perceived winner and loser. And so another answer to the first part of your question is the need to think about what's termed a just transition, right? If people who worked in the fossil fuel industry are going to lose their jobs and not have training and opportunities to transition their existing skills in, say, welding or pipe fitting or whatever into the renewable economy, then we have a problem. Like, what are we going to do with Appalachia and coal miners, right? Coal miners. And there are like really, a lot of people working on this problem, but we have to build a future that works for everybody. And I think part of what I'm actually trying to do with this book is to show people there are possible futures where there is a place for everyone. Because otherwise we will continue to have this sort of resistance. And when you ask about sort of like the politics of it, I have two answers. One is this is why I work at the city government level, where you can be more practical and granular about solutions, and it's sort of less about which party you're in and more about like, what is the infrastructure that we need changed in order to deal with sea level rise? Like, how do we need to change our sewer system? How do we need to change whatever? And that's just sort of like more of like a nuts and bolts conversations that can happen at local levels. And also, when you do the polling, people of any political persuasion would like clean air and clean water. So you can sort of skip the climate conversation in general and just talk about green jobs, or people are really excited about the possibilities of careers in wind and solar throughout the country. The greatest deployment of wind energy in the country is in Ohio and Texas. I think they're pretty much at the top at solar too. So like these are very much seen as like great career opportunities for people. So you can skip the debate of like, is climate change caused by anthropogenic, carbon emissions, and get straight to like, would you like to be enrolled in this job training program? So for me, depending on what audience I'm talking to, I sometimes talk less about climate change and more about like the economics, and the need to protect us from extreme weather, how weather patterns are shifting and affecting agriculture, how that's bad for farmers, if we're heading towards this extreme of like either flood or drought and nothing in between. So how do we protect farmers? How do we make sure coal miners have jobs? How do we make sure that that we're safe? But it's very fraught. not to downplay that. I mean, some of those regulatory rollbacks were so absurd. It like took away safety measures on pipelines that were put into place after the Deepwater Horizon BP spill. I'm just like, we're like removing the requirement for valves. It's just like, it's just like vindictive anti-environment nonsense. I mean, the short answer is I don't know. But I think what we're seeing around the economics of renewables is that they are the future, especially, and fossil fuels are losing a lot of their social license to operate. But it is still very profitable. Like they are still expanding because it is profitable. But a lot of that profitability is because it is also heavily subsidized by our taxpayer dollars. To the tune of many billions of dollars a year, which like if we could just make this a fair fight, we could win. And so I think that, I wish more people understood just that part. The playing field is not level at all. It is not like an energy meritocracy. So yeah, I mean, fossil fuels are not going away anytime soon unless we force them to, especially in industries like steel production, some like heavy manufacturing. It's like a little bit trickier to get the temperatures we need for smelting or whatever with solar and wind. There are ways to do all of this stuff, but the ways that we've had massive waves of innovation in the past are through government support, right? Like the reason that we have the internet is like largely government support. The reason that we have electric cars is largely through government support. I mean, the US government bailed out Tesla to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. It almost went under multiple times, which Elon Musk doesn't really talk about.
It's amazing how that never comes up.
So weird. He's just like an incredibly good businessman.
I mean, he invented Tesla, don't you know?
Also that. So I think that's the big question, right? Is like the Inflation Reduction Act was a huge step forward in that regard, right? We've a huge investment in R&D, which is part of what we need, because like while we essentially have the solutions that we need, there's of course more innovation that needs to happen. So it's one of those things that's like the conservative impulse to small government, and then turn around and say like permitting is too slow. It's like, well, you gutted our government and now there's literally no one sitting in that office to review your environmental impact statements, is like a particularly, horrible mindset, like really detrimental. So, I mean, we'll see. Depends what we all do. Thank you. Sea level rise is inevitable. The question is how much. And so will all of New York City be underwater in your lifetime? Probably not. But we are no longer talking inches, we are talking feet of sea level rise. So the coastline will be different. And if you think about feet even, it seems like, 1 or 2 feet's maybe not that much. But then you put a storm surge or high tide on top of that, and we're talking about a huge problem. And with the new science that's coming out about the melting of Greenland and Antarctica, we're potentially talking meters and not feet by the end of this century. So, and when I say by the end of this century, like that's actually not that far away anymore, right? Like I always think of 2100 as really far away, but like your kids will be alive then. Like the next generation, like we're talking about like one generation. And the problem is there are millions and millions and millions of people. 40% of the American population lives in a coastal county. 20% lives in a coastal city. We can't make all of our changes in 2099. And all the sea level rise isn't going to come in 2099 too, right? Like it is a continual escalation of the challenge. And so a lot of the work that I have coming up is really to force people to start dealing with these inevitabilities now, because we don't know exactly how bad it's going to be, but we know it's going to get worse. And because of the huge amount of infrastructure, the millions of people who are living, will have to like move. We have to, be more realistic about what that entails and start soon. We mostly know where it comes from. It's pretty easy to track, especially plastic pollution, for example, we know is largely coming from like 10 major rivers in, I think, mostly in Asia, because Western economies have like changed culture and inundated those places with a lot of single-use plastics, and their like, waste management systems have not been able to keep up, right? So the answer for plastics is very easy to know where they're coming from. And in fact, that is where we should be cleaning them up, is in the rivers themselves, and not trying to just like scoop up random bits of plastic in the ocean, where they degrade in the sun and the salt. And most ocean plastic is like smaller than your pinky fingernail. So if you're scooping that up, you're scooping up all the marine life, most of the marine life as well, which is not a great solution. So that the provenance and tracking of these things is actually pretty straightforward. Well, the answer is that all of us driving individual cars is not the answer. Like, we really need to be investing in public transit. I wish I didn't have to buy a car in 2020 to reach my mother, but there's like literally no other way, right? I'm really excited that there has been more of an investment in expanding our train system in the US. So hopefully more of us can get around on trains. Unfortunately, high-speed rail seems to still not be a thing that we're getting it together on in this country. But, it's been really nice to see even like the ferry system in this area improve over the last decade. So in terms of transit, I certainly hope we don't live in a world where everyone needs to own an individual car, because individual cars take a lot of materials. There's a lot of mining involved, and what we're starting to finally see is converting existing vehicles to electric instead of making just new ones. We're starting to see more of that, which will make them hopefully in the longer term more accessible, because even used electric cars right now are very expensive. Although the average price of an electric car, a new one, is now meeting the average cost of a combustion engine. But a lot of people can't afford a new car, period. So that doesn't change. But it is important to note that they are not actually more expensive now that we have more models on the electric side. But the answer is government. It is policy change. It is investing in public services. It is investing in public housing. Is it investing in public transit? It is investing in community centers. It is making sure that governments support community organizations, so that after extreme weather, those community organizations are robust enough and resourced enough to be the first responders, because they're the ones that know what their communities need. This is not going to be solved by everyone getting an electric car. And like, I am not Oprah, and you do not have a Tesla card under your seats right now. Great point.
We'll take one last question.
Yeah. It's possible. As Roxane sort of started us off, I'm not an optimist. I'm a realist. I'm a scientist. I see the direction things are going. I see the scientific projections. I know things are certainly going to get a little worse, if not a lot worse. And so it really is a question of how we adapt to the change that's coming and prevent the worst. And there's so many better ways to live on this planet. And so my hope with my work is that I can help people to start to see that there is like so much joy to be had in making this transformation. It's not just an endless list of homework. It's like, making cool movies. It's riding bikes without being scared of being hit by trucks. It's like all of these things that just, it's really convenient composting. I don't know why I find composting so gratifying. I feel like such a good person when I compost. I'm like, I'm nailing it. And like food waste, rotting, and releasing methane in landfills is actually like a huge problem. So it's like a million of these little things. When it comes to the ocean, protecting and restoring these coastal ecosystems like mangroves and wetlands that actually sequester more carbon per acre than a forest on land, right? These are really valuable, important ecosystems that are also helping protect us from the impacts of storms as that physical barrier that can be more effective than a seawall. So I feel like a lot of people don't know about all the solutions that we have, which is why I'm here, why I'm finding myself holding a microphone more and more these days. But like, there is no one who knows what the future is going to be. We have all the information we need to understand, if we do X, we get Y. But we don't actually know what we are going to do. So it's sort of, the answer is like, it's sort of up to you. For better and for worse. It's a lot of responsibility, but like so much possibility to create the future that we actually want to live in. Yeah. Should we do a poem?
Yeah, let's do a poem to close things.
This is not a poem I usually read when given the chance, but it's called November. And this is a poem that was Catherine, my co-editor, and I found on Twitter. It was a Twitter thread. And we were like, this is good. And it's written by someone whose pen name is Lina Odell because she's from a super conservative religious community that doesn't believe in climate change. And so she has to have a fake name for writing her climate poetry. So, November. If I can't save us, then let me feel you, happy and safe under my chin. If this will drown or burn, then let us drink starlight, nap under trees, sing on beaches. The morning rush to sit indoors is for what again? If we are dying, then let me rip open and bleed love. Spill it, spend it, see how much there is. The reward for misers is what again? If this life is ending, then let me begin a new one.
Thank you. Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, thank you so much for joining us.
Dr. Roxane Gay.
It's the attack of doctors. But we can't really help you in any kind of medical emergency. But truly, thank you for joining us.